So thank you all for coming so early in the morning, and I hope you've had your coffee and look forward to a long day. So with that uplifting note, my task this morning is to introduce our talks, and so this is going to be something different. And I'm going to take us through this question, is quality of life a priority in today's treatment from a patient perspective? And we talk about quality of life in this field, of course we talk about health-related quality of life. And this is probably, those of you in the room already know this, a multidimensional concept that captures physical, mental, emotional, and social dimensions. And we tend to talk about quality of life in measurable terms, and there are ways to measure outcomes, for instance, like qualities, etc. And I'm not going to talk about those in great detail today because that will largely be the task of the other speakers this morning. But there are also other ways of measuring outcomes, patient-reported outcomes, experiential data, and I'll just give a very brief example of this at the end. And so as I set the scene or try to set the scene for the other speakers today, I'd like to take us through a slightly different journey from a slightly different field in order to explore the difference between measurable and meaningful. And so stating the obvious, we are, of course, all human. Patients are human, clinicians are human, and most of you will probably recognize this image. And this is the hierarchy of needs from Abraham Maslow. And in addition to pointing out the obvious, which is that we have complex needs, basic needs, physiological and psychological needs, and self-fulfillment needs, I'd also like to point out that when Maslow developed this theory, he was really rowing against the tide of psychology at the time. And at the time, it was largely driven by the Freudian aspect of treating people like a bag of symptoms. Everything was a symptom and everything was a negative. And Maslow was one of the first people to turn psychology around and to look at psychology from a positive angle and from the perspective of the positive attributes of humans. And while we stay in the psychological journey, I'd like to go into social psychology for just a second to talk about human values as well. This is the theory of basic human values developed by Shalom Schwartz, who's an Israeli social psychologist. And as you can see, we are very complex as humans. These are universal values, so depending on what culture you live in, what religion you ascribe to, what country, what upbringing you have had, you will be on a slightly different part of this graph. And in case you can't read it, the colors, they represent self-direction, stimulation, hedonism, which isn't what you think so early in the morning. It's even things like enjoying your life, having fun. We call it a fun factor in our community. Achievement, power, security, tradition, conformity, benevolence, and universalism. So I'm trying to begin to set out the complexity of humans, of all of us, clinicians and patients, from having human needs to having human values. And as we build on this complexity, I'd like to move into the field of economics briefly. And there's an economist known as the Barefoot Economist, for those of you that haven't heard of him. His name is Manfred Max Neef. He's Chilean. And Manfred Max Neef is another one of these people that went against the current of his discipline a little bit. And in reaction to this top-down liberal economic theory, he developed the human scale development theory. And this is a theory for economic development, for countries developing, that focuses on achieving fundamental human needs rather than economic growth. And it focuses on increasing self-reliance. It focuses on the interdependence of humans with their surroundings, mostly their natural surroundings, the environment specifically. It's very much a development by the people, for the people, and a platform for democratic decision-making. And so what does this actually look like? Not to make you think this talk will be too fuzzy. So there are 9 fundamental needs that he's developed, and the way to achieving them is by progressing from left to right. And in case you can't read it very well, the need is on the left, and you achieve this by being, and then having, and then doing, and then interacting. And the theory really is that if you meet a person's fundamental needs, they become active actors in their own development. And if we look at this from the perspective of our community, from a health perspective and a patient perspective, I'd like to just outline 3 of these 9 fundamental needs, namely protection, participation, and freedom. Of course, meeting someone's health needs falls under subsistence, but that's not very interesting for us because that's the administration of a drug. And as I think everyone in this room probably agrees, treatment is much more than just the administration of a drug. So how do we achieve protection? Well, we achieve protection when we are able to be autonomous, when we are able to have care. And we have that when we have a social system, a social security, a health system. And when we are autonomous and we have a health system, we begin to cooperate. And we begin to take care of ourselves and of others. We begin to help. And we begin to be active actors in a social environment like the social environment of our care settings. If we move on to participation, the need of participation, if we are able to be receptive, if we're able to be dedicated, for instance, to our own care or the care of others, then we have responsibility and we have rights. We start cooperating and we start expressing opinions and we start being active in associations such as the EHA or patient organizations. And if we look at the need of freedom, if we are autonomous, if we have self-esteem and open-mindedness, then we can exercise our equal rights and we can exercise choice. And you can already begin to see how meeting these fundamental needs makes humans, but more importantly for us, patients, equal actors in their treatment and in their care. And just because, this is the EHA and not Psychology 101 or Economics 101, I'll move us back to our field, and specifically because it's important in this community to talk about non-malignant, as Loris has pointed out, I'd like to bring an example from the hemophilia space and an example of the infamous EQ5D. So this is a friend of mine. He has hemophilia. In 2010, he was 28 years old. He was on demand, which means that he was infusing his treatment only when he got a bleed, for 70% of his life. He had less than 90-degree movement in his ankle. He suffered 33 bleeds on average per year, and he needed help walking more than 50 meters. And at the time, he was 28. His EQ5D response was 2, 2, 2, and 1. 6 years later, he was 34. He was still on the same treatment, it was the same therapy, but it was administered prophylactically, which means that he administered it regularly in anticipation of bleeds. So it's the same treatment, it's a new regime. Now he has 96 degrees movement in his ankle. There's a significant reduction in acute pain, but still a lot of chronic pain, and this is something Loris and I will be able to talk to you much lengthier about, and maybe in another setting. In the non-malignant space, we deal with disability paradoxes, and we deal with the chronic inherited pain. So our patient population has many different challenges, even psychologically, facing their treatment and facing their treatment choices. He reduced to 2 bleeds per year, but his EQ5D did not change. It was still 2, 2, 2, and 1. And so from a utility perspective, the effect was 0. But my question to you is, was it really 0? Was there no benefit? Because that year he climbed Kilimanjaro. And so and I'm running out of time, as we talk about quality of life, the question really is measuring the right outcomes the right way. I have another friend in the hemophilia space who's very competitive. And, he doesn't want to become a professional, soccer player, football player, or volleyball player. He just wants to feel like he gets to compete with his friends. He's male, he's watched his friends play football, he's watched them play rugby, he wants to play along. That would make him very happy. Is that something society is considering worthwhile investing in? And yet, if we think about humans' fundamental needs and fundamental values, that's exactly what he wants. I have another friend who was denied access to hepatitis C treatment. In the hemophilia community, we've had a lot of infections with hepatitis C and HIV in the 1980s due to contaminated blood. And at the time, the DAAs were coming out much more effective treatment, 90% cure rate in hepatitis C. He was denied the treatment because it wasn't considered cost effective. And yet the thing he wanted to do was walk his daughter down the aisle. And he died 2 weeks before she got married. And that's an outcome that matters to a patient, and yet it doesn't matter to society because we can't put an economic value on it. And so my conclusions, as I set the stage for the other speakers, is quality of life a priority in treatment today? Some people will say yes, some people will say no, but I'm going to say maybe, because we're talking about a lot of very different disease states, and the question really is, it depends on the disease state, and it depends on the partnership between the stakeholders in that disease state and their understanding of that specific set of patient needs. Are quality of life measures fit for purpose? Probably not. They really should be more appropriately weighted. They should have variability and they should have flexibility over time. Where a patient is today is not where a patient is tomorrow. My friend who feels competitive is in a very different place from my friend who wanted to walk his daughter down the aisle. And without patient-reported outcomes and experiential data, we're not going to have the cross point between meeting societal values or what society thinks patients should want and meeting personal needs and values and what the personal quest is for that person's specific place in his life and what would quality of life mean for him. So as I set the scene for other speakers this morning, I'd really just like to leave you with the question, where does a person start from and where are they going? Thank you.